The moment the gun appeared, the room stopped existing. No shouting, no scrambling for cover, just a dozen of the most powerful crime bosses in America sitting perfectly still, realizing they were seconds away from witnessing something that could not be undone. This wasn't a street corner or a back alley. This was a closed room, neutral ground, the place where violence was forbidden not by law, but by survival. In that room sat Lucky Luciano, the architect of a fragile new order meant to keep men like this from tearing the city apart. Across from him stood Dutch Schultz, furious, cornered, and running out of time. When words failed him, Dutch did the unthinkable. He reached into his jacket and drew a gun. That single motion broke every rule the underworld depended on. This wasn't just a threat against one man. It was a challenge to the system itself, a declaration that votes didn't matter, restraint didn't matter, and that personal fear outweighed collective survival. In that instant, everyone in the room understood the truth. Even if the trigger was never pulled, something had already ended. What happened next didn't look like a victory. There was no blood on the carpet, no body on the floor. The gun went down. The meeting continued. On the surface, order was restored, but beneath it, a verdict had already been reached. Because in worlds built on power, there are moments you can't walk away from. You can leave the room alive and still be finished. 8 days later, Dutch Schultz was dead. Not because he tried to kill someone, but because he revealed he was willing to destroy the rules that kept everyone alive. This is the story of that moment. The quiet confrontation that decided a man's fate before a single shot was fired, and why in the Mafia, breaking the system is more dangerous than breaking the law. By 1935, the greatest threat to organized crime in New York wasn't another gangster, it was a prosecutor who refused to play the game. Thomas E. Dewey wasn't loud, theatrical, or corruptible. He didn't raid speakeasies for headlines or make speeches about moral decay. He did something far more dangerous. He built cases slowly, methodically, and without leaks. Witness by witness, ledger by ledger. He followed money where intimidation usually stopped investigations cold. And for the first time in decades, it worked. Within months, men who believed themselves untouchable were being convicted, not on rumors or shaky testimony, but on records. Account books, corroborated statements. Dewey's office didn't need confessions, it needed patterns. And those patterns pointed directly at the structures that had protected organized crime since Prohibition began. For the newer generation of bosses, this was alarming but manageable. They understood heat, they knew when to slow operations, move money, or shift focus. But for older figures, men who had grown up solving every problem with threats or bullets, Dewey represented something terrifying. A problem violence couldn't fix quietly. No one felt that pressure more acutely than Dutch Schultz. Dewey's investigations were closing in on Schultz's numbers operations. Subpoenas were stacking up, witnesses were talking, accountants were nervous. Schultz didn't see a long legal battle ahead, he saw a countdown. And prison, for a man like him, wasn't punishment, it was extinction. That fear reshaped his thinking. Where others looked for containment, Dutch looked for elimination. In his mind, the solution was simple and familiar. Remove the source. Make the problem disappear the way problems always had. But killing a prosecutor wasn't like silencing a witness or bribing a judge. It wasn't just illegal, it was system-shattering. That distinction mattered. The commission had been created precisely to prevent this kind of reaction. It existed to stop panic from becoming policy, and individual desperation from dragging everyone into catastrophe. Killing a public official would invite federal attention at a scale the underworld had never faced. It would turn organized crime from a shadow economy into a national emergency. This is where the conflict truly began. Not between men, but between two approaches to power. Dewey represented a new kind of threat, impersonal, relentless, immune to fear, and Dutch Schultz, cornered by that threat, was preparing to answer it with the oldest tool he knew. The question wasn't whether Dutch was afraid. It was whether the system he belonged to would allow fear to make the decision. And in that tension, the fate of one man and the future of organized crime began to separate. Fear changes people long before it breaks them. By the time the commission gathered in October 1935, Dutch Schultz wasn't thinking like a boss anymore, he was thinking like a man with a clock running out. Indictments don't announce themselves with sirens. They arrive quietly, wrapped in subpoenas, witness lists, and sealed envelopes. Dutch could feel them closing in. For years, his world had obeyed a simple rule. Pressure could be pushed back. Cops could be bribed. Witnesses could be scared. Rivals could be eliminated. That rule had built his empire. But now it was failing him. The investigation wasn't loud enough to fight and not corruptible enough to stop. For the first time, Dutch was facing a threat he couldn't intimidate away. That's why he forced the issue into the one arena where he still believed strength mattered: the commission. To Dutch, the commission was an inconvenience masquerading as progress. Too many voices, too much restraint, too many men who believed survival meant compromise. He'd never accepted the idea that votes could override action. In his mind, leadership meant deciding and forcing others to follow. The meeting wasn't called to debate. It was called to legitimize a decision he'd already made. Killing a prosecutor wasn't about revenge, it was about reclaiming control. If the commission approved it, the risk would be shared. Everyone in the room would be bound to the outcome. And if they didn't approve it, Dutch planned to prove something else: that rules were only real until someone strong enough ignored them. Across the table sat Lucky Luciano, who understood exactly what Dutch was doing. Luciano didn't hear a proposal, he heard panic disguised as resolve. He saw a man trying to turn personal fear into collective responsibility, and that was dangerous. The commission had been built to prevent this exact scenario. One volatile figure dragging everyone into a disaster they didn't choose. Approving a hit on a public official wouldn't just invite retaliation, it would erase the last illusion of containment. Once that line was crossed, there would be no scaling back, no negotiations, no return to business as usual. Dutch mistook resistance for hesitation. When the room didn't immediately support him, he read it as weakness. He didn't see caution, he saw betrayal. And that misreading pushed him toward the one act that would guarantee his isolation. Because the moment a man proves he's willing to shatter the system to save himself, the system stops protecting him. Dutch didn't understand that yet, but everyone else in the room did. The commission was never meant to be dramatic. Its power came from being boring, from routine, procedure, and restraint. Votes instead of vendettas, discussion instead of gunfire. That was the entire point. And for 4 years, it had worked. Until that night, when Dutch Schultz finally said what he wanted: the removal of Thomas E. Dewey. The room didn't erupt, it tightened. Every man there understood the stakes immediately. This wasn't about one investigation or one boss's survival. It was about whether the system they depended on would survive contact with panic. Killing a prosecutor wasn't just murder. It was an escalation that couldn't be contained. Courts would harden, politicians would posture, federal agencies would flood New York with resources and ambition. The quiet arrangements that kept operations invisible would collapse under scrutiny. Everyone in that room knew it, even those who didn't like admitting it. That's why the vote mattered. When Lucky Luciano called for it, he wasn't testing loyalty. He was testing the system itself. Could it still function when a powerful member demanded something catastrophic? Or would fear override structure the moment pressure became personal? Hands went up slowly, one by one, against the proposal, not because they felt safe, but because they understood consequences. Each raised hand was an admission. If this line was crossed, no one would be able to undo it. When the count finished, the result was decisive. Dutch stood alone. That isolation changed the room. A vote like that doesn't just reject an idea, it reclassifies the person who proposed it. In that moment, Dutch Schultz stopped being a difficult member of the commission and became a liability, not yet an enemy, but no longer protected by consensus. Dutch didn't accept that distinction. To him, the vote wasn't a process. It was an insult. Proof that men he considered weaker were willing to sacrifice him to protect themselves. And once that belief set in, the meeting stopped being political. It became personal. What Dutch failed to grasp was the finality of the vote. In this system, Decisions didn't need to be enforced immediately to be real. The moment the Commission said no, the future narrowed. Options disappeared. Protection became conditional. The structure Luciano had designed didn't punish dissent, but it withdrew insulation from those who threatened its survival. By refusing to accept the outcome, Dutch crossed from disagreement into defiance. And defiance, in a system built on mutual restraint, is the most dangerous signal a man can send. Because once a group concludes that you can't be controlled by rules, the only remaining question becomes how long they're willing to tolerate the risk. That question was already forming in the room, and Dutch Schultz, still standing there, hadn't realized yet that the most important decision of the night had already been made, not with a gun, but with raised hands. What happened next wasn't inevitable, it was chosen. When Dutch Schultz stood up after the vote, the room sensed the shift immediately. This was no longer a debate about risk or policy. It was about ego under pressure. Dutch had lost the argument, lost the vote, and lost the protection that came with both. For a man who built his power on intimidation, that loss was intolerable. The movement toward his jacket wasn't tactical, it was emotional. A final attempt to reclaim authority through fear when legitimacy had slipped away. Drawing a gun inside a commission meeting wasn't just reckless, it was sacrilege. The entire purpose of that room was to keep violence out. By introducing a weapon, Dutch wasn't threatening a man. He was rejecting the idea that rules applied to him at all. Across the table, Lucky Luciano didn't reach for anything. No weapon, no protection, no signal to allies. That restraint mattered. In moments like this, escalation feeds chaos. Luciano understood that if he responded with force, the system he'd built would collapse into the very behavior it was designed to prevent. Instead, he spoke in the only language that still carried weight: consequences. He didn't threaten retaliation, he didn't promise revenge, he explained the math. If a shot was fired, Dutch wouldn't be facing one enemy, he'd be facing all of them. 11 organizations, 11 networks, 11 sets of resources committed to a single outcome. Even survival wouldn't equal escape. There would be no neutral ground left. That clarity broke the spell. The gun wavered not because Dutch lacked nerve, but because he finally saw the horizon he'd been running toward. Violence would not restore his position, it would finalize his isolation. Pulling the trigger wouldn't prove strength, it would confirm that he was uncontrollable. In that realization, the balance shifted. Authority returned to the room without a shot fired. The gun lowered. The meeting continued. On the surface, order was restored. But something irreversible had happened. From that moment on, Dutch Schultz was no longer a man the system could tolerate. He had demonstrated a willingness to destroy the structure rather than submit to it. In any organization built to last, that is the unforgivable offense. The irony was brutal. The gun never fired, yet it accomplished exactly what Dutch feared most. It marked him as a problem that could no longer be managed, only removed. And once a system reaches that conclusion, time stops being a question of if and becomes a question of when. When people remember this story, they often focus on the gun, the frozen room, the seconds that felt like hours. But Lucky Luciano didn't survive that night because Dutch hesitated. Dutch was finished long before he lowered the weapon. The real turning point wasn't the threat, it was what the threat revealed. In that room, Dutch Schultz showed everyone exactly who he was when pressure became unbearable. He showed that fear mattered more to him than restraint, and pride mattered more than survival of the system. The moment he chose intimidation over rules, he made himself incompatible with the structure that protected everyone else. That's how power really works, not through violence, but through tolerance. As long as the system tolerates you, mistakes can be managed, conflicts can be mediated, and danger can be contained. The instant the system decides you're too volatile to control, protection disappears. And without protection, even the most feared men become temporary. Dutch didn't die because he pointed a gun. Men had done that before and lived. He died because he proved he was willing to burn the entire framework down to save himself. No organization built to last can allow that kind of threat to exist. 8 days later, the outcome wasn't dramatic, it was procedural. No speeches, no declarations, just the removal of a liability. Business resumed. The system survived. And that's the lesson most people miss. Lucky Luciano didn't win because he was tougher, colder, or more violent. He won because he understood something Dutch never did. Rules are not a weakness, they're a filter. They decide who belongs and who doesn't, who gets protection and who gets erased. In the end, Dutch Schultz wasn't killed by a rival. He was removed by a system he tried to defy. And in worlds built on power, that is the only ending that ever truly lasts.